Episode 58 of the podcast. This week, I'm giving some examples from my work week. So, I have an example of my appointment with a 13-week-old puppy who needed a little bit of grooming and just a little bit of puppy lesson. And also, two dogs that I did a training lesson with, where we also were incorporating some of our handling skills for health and comfort. You're listening to the Creating Great Grooming Dogs podcast. I'm Chrissy Newmeyer-Smith. I'm a certified professional groomer, certified behavior consultant for canines, certified professional dog trainer, and the owner of Happy Critters in Nashua, New Hampshire. And this, my friends and colleagues, is where grooming and training meet. This week, I want to share a couple of stories from my own week. So for a couple of dogs that I've worked with this week. And the first one is I got contacted about a 13-week-old Malshi. I think that's Maltese Shih Tzu? I'm not really sure. Sometimes you can read an owner and say, if I ask what this is, it's going to turn into a how do you not know about my purebred mix conversation. I don't want to offend her, so I didn't ask, but it's a Malshi. But she's 3.25 pounds, itty bitty bitty, 13 weeks old. So I want you to think about that's a perfect age for a little bit of grooming. And the vet sent her to me, which is awesome because she already had her vet visit. She's got an owner who, is very involved with this dog, and she just got her, I believe, 2 weeks before. She brought her to the vet already, and the vet said, I think you should have Chrissy groom her, and just do a little bit, not a full groom. So she's already thinking, okay, we're not doing a full groom, but she needs to start learning about it now. Right? I want that to be more of a norm. So if you're a trainer or a vet tech, I want you to be thinking we should be sending a dog for just a little bit of brushing, right? Don't wait until they need a full grooming, but the grooming part and being around grooming is so important. So anyway, this little dog, teeny tiny, she's already been to the vet, and we set it up as a half-hour appointment. Okay, I'm a house call groomer. So for me, that means I'm going to drive over there and just spend like half an hour and whatever we can do in that half hour. So when we're arranging this appointment, I've already talked to her about my safety policy. And for those of you who are regular listeners, you should know what the safety policy is, but it's something to the effect of, if your dog is wiggly or aggressive or scared or even overly friendly, we're going to have to calm your dog down. Because what we're trying to do is teach them to be calm, comfortable, cooperative, help them have a good experience with grooming today. And it's not about the haircut. And then I'll charge for my time spent working with your dog. So we've already established that. I have a scheduling app, so I've texted her my safety policy. She signed it, no, this makes perfect sense, and this is what I want for my dog, right? You see how we're already working together? Because the vet has told her, this is what I recommend for your dog is to have a really good experience this young and not have it be about getting the grooming done, right? And an owner who heard it from her vet and now hears it from her groomer and will probably hear the same thing from the trainer that she goes to, right? We want to all work together to get this dog started right. So now it's time for the appointment, and I come over, and while I'm bringing in my equipment, I set my equipment down, I'm still in my jacket, and I get on the floor and start playing with this puppy. Now, this puppy is really happy about me, so that's good. If this puppy were nervous, I'd probably just get on the floor and let the puppy come over and not play with the puppy. Play coy. Let the puppy want it, But this puppy was like, all over it. I want to play, right? So we're doing a little bit of play and a little bit of touching. And then I start setting my stuff up, take off the jacket, set things up. I do use one of the pheromone products. And if you're not familiar with Adaptil, Sentry makes another version, but they're a pheromone that is supposed to kind of mimic the scent that mom gives off while her puppies are nursing, right? It's a pheromone. It's not a medication. It's not a sedative, and it's not a miracle cure. It's not going to make a dog instantly feel happy, but it's one of the ways that we can stack the deck, right? All right, well, it's harmless and it could help. So I was using the Sentry version, which is a gel, and it's just easier to keep in my grooming equipment, little tube. But I put a little bit on my finger, and let her explore that and put a little bit on her fur just so that she can kind of have that smell. And then I started putting up more of my stuff, pulling out some scissors, making sure that, clippers are plugged in, even if I don't think I'm going to be using them to trim her fur, for her to hear those sounds, get used to it. So I get everything all set up, and now it's time to put her up on my table. Now, I'm holding her close to my body, and I'm putting her on the table and kind of leaning in and petting her. I'm not expecting her to stand on her own yet. She's 13 weeks old. She's itty bitty. I'm not using the grooming loop this time because I find that having my hands on her the whole time is actually really helpful. We've talked before about teaching dogs about grooming is about teaching them very, very hands-on, both hands, really working with them on the idea that I have hands on me constantly and that's something I'm comfortable with. So I'm working with her to be comfortable with having hands on her. And then I'm like brushing her a little bit and touching around her eyes. One of the things that they needed trimming was a little bit around her eyes and a little bit on her backside and her sanitary. Now the vet had already taken a clip or two underneath her sanitary, so it was more just trimming a little bit around her bum. But I want you to think about just getting near the eyes first with my fingers and working on still. So she's 13 weeks old. She doesn't know anything yet. she's this tiny little blank slate. She doesn't have opinions yet about how she feels about somebody touching her eyes. So I'm putting my finger on the corner of her eye. And she's super, super wiggly. But when she's still, I back off. And then when it's time for wiggles, we've talked about this before, use the wiggles as a reward. Like, then I'd pick her up, like, oh, let's get wiggly again. And I'm so silly with her, and I'm picking her up. And then we're back on the table. Now, the back on the table is when we're still again. And it's almost like bad acting, like super, super obvious soap opera acting. Like, oh, and now we're still. And if I pick her up, like, okay, now we can be a little bit silly. Or if I put her on the floor, like, now we can be a little bit silly. But then we're going to pick you up. And on the table is, and now we're going to calm together. Calm together, right? So I'm touching her eyes with a finger. I'm touching her eyes with a comb. Not her eyeballs. You guys know what I'm talking about. But I'm touching around her eyes with a comb. I get the scissors near her and just start letting her, see that they make a noise. Because a lot of trainers aren't necessarily thinking about that. Not only are we thinking about looking at the equipment, we don't want them to actively touch equipment. We don't want them to actively move away or move toward. We want them to kind of be still for equipment. But that each piece of equipment makes its own sound. Brushes make a sound too. I run my finger over a brush. That slicker brush noise, that kind of whoop, whoop noise, right? Like that's a weird noise for some dogs. They're like, I didn't know the thing made a noise. So I'm getting her used to some of these tools, touching her in a couple little areas, and then giving her some wiggle time, putting her back down for calm, giving her some wiggles, putting her back down for calm, talking to her through the whole time. Notice I haven't said anything about treats because I'm not giving her cookies for this, right? This is not cookie time. This is let's work together and have fun. Because at this age, she's all about fun anyway. I don't need to add any more motivation. She's like, somebody's interacting with me. This is perfect, right? And that's kind of who she is. And part of why I'm doing an example of a specific dog is because people keep asking me for like very specific questions. So hopefully you're seeing some dog that you know in this example. Because she was just really, really silly. She doesn't need anything to make her sillier. She's already having a good time. And eventually we would have to fade cookies out of grooming. Right? We don't have to fade my hands out. We don't have to fade my interactions out. But we would have to fade cookies out. So we're going to skip the cookies and just work with her on what we're doing. Now, she started to get calmer for longer. That little bit of still would last longer. And then the sillies again. Because it became very, very obvious, like, it's still. And sillies. And still. And sillies. And still. Right? I was not persistent to getting in the corners of her eyes. She was a little bit too wiggly, and it was her first time, right? We had already planned for only about half an hour. But I was able to trim the hair above her eyes so that she could now see again. I was able to comb in front of her eyes and get in touching with combs and brushes and fingers. I just wasn't able to trim in front of the eyes. I could have pushed it, but like I've said before, it's not necessarily if we can get it done. It really is if we should. And I didn't think that it was important enough in that moment to lose what we had built up. Because within 15 minutes of kind of working with her on this stuff, I was able to get scissors in front of her eyes. And her mom was pretty happy with that. She said, wow, she's doing much better than I thought she would. But if I were just trying to have her on the table and be calm the whole time, at this age, she wouldn't have been able to do it. So we can use silly and wiggly as a reward for still, right? And we can use it to our advantage. She's going to be wiggly. Why not just put it on my timetable? So we're getting her calm and we're working around areas. She was pretty good about me lifting her tail, moving her tail, touching her backside. I was able to scissor that up really well. I was able to brush her tail. And during this, I'm also explaining to her owner ways for her owner to work on things at home. I was able to trim up the pads of her feet and just round her feet a little bit. Now, she had already been to the vet, so she had had a nail trim. I'm assuming it went pretty well. I know my vet, and the fact that they're sending a dog for grooming purposes to get them used to it, like we're kind of on the same page with let's make this the best experience we can. So I was able to trim around feet, and we just did a little bit of touching everywhere all over. I did pull out my clippers and just got her used to hey, this is a weird noise. Wow, that's weird. And for a little while, I had my clippers on the table just so that they could be there while she was learning other things, so that she could see, oh, that's not a big deal. Of course, I don't want to keep my clippers on the table. I don't like having tools on my table. And at one point, I was like, okay, let's move the $200 thing and put that someplace else. We don't want those on the table. But that was for her learning purposes, to have a couple extra things on the table, to be around the clippers when they aren't necessarily doing anything to her, near her, like they're just on the table. So when we think about these little guys, we can be very, very hands-on and make it fun and avoid the use of cookies that will have to be faded out later. So she's learning about her hands on me are safe, right? This person's touching me all over, having her hands on me, that's safe. Sometimes it's fun, sometimes it's calm. But calm isn't necessarily the lack of fun. Calm is just soothing. So we're going from fun to soothing, to fun to soothing, from silly to calmer. And it should be a really good experience for her. And it was a good experience for her. That was a half hour well spent. And I know that sometimes as groomers, we have trouble talking owners into just doing a puppy visit that has nothing to do with any sort of a goal. But if they start hearing it from their vet, and they're hearing it from a trainer, and they're hearing it from their groomer, and they're hearing it from their breeder, and we all start saying the same things, make this just a puppy get to know the groomer, let's see what we can get done. Give me the couple of things that are most important to you as an owner, and let's see what we can do. Then maybe we can get these dogs started off right. Because she started off right. I suspect that the next time is going to be even easier. And then the next time after that, it's going to be even easier. Because she's learning about it properly. And she's learning that this is safe and it's going to be okay. If you're enjoying my podcast, please remember to subscribe so that you don't miss any episodes. Here's another example from my week this week. I'm doing training with two young dogs. One is a 10-month-old German Shepherd. One is about a 2.5-year-old lab mix. I think he looks kind of pointerish. But they're both really sweet dogs. They're having some issues with, one of them is having some issues with other dogs. And when they sees other dogs, getting a little bit over the top. The other one is having some issues with when people come to their office. They have an office and the dog is like, I don't know, these are strangers just approaching as if they live here, right? Normal stuff. The owners are awesome. These dogs are great. They just need to know these extra things. So one of the things that I worked with them on this week, which is now starting our second week, this would be our fourth meeting together, right? But part of what I worked on this week was I talked to the owners about, we're going to get down on the floor and really touch them all over. and look at body parts and pick up feet and look inside mouths and sniff inside an ear. And these owners are already doing a lot of that. So I wanted to make sure that we were doing it in a way that correlated with emergency care at home, veterinary visits, and grooming visits. But the purpose isn't just for vet visits and grooming visits and stuff, but I want you to think about we want our dogs to trust us. And that is some very, very personal handling that we do when we have our hands all over a dog, right? That's a bonding moment. And for dogs that are a little bit unsure about strangers or about other dogs, we're trying to tell them as owners, listen, I'm your safe zone. I keep you safe. I'm telling you everything is safe out there. And we have a better chance of doing that if we can also make them feel 100% perfectly safe with us touching them. Right? If a dog isn't comfortable with having their owners touch them, I also observe that they also don't take their owner's word for it when things are safe outside. Now, that might seem a little odd, but it is something I have observed. I've observed this over the years, and that's part of being a groomer who asks a lot of questions about behavior. Is that, these dogs that the owners come in and they're like, oh yeah, he won't let us touch around his eyes, or he won't let us touch his tail, or he hates it when we try to wipe off his feet, so we just, leave him in the mudroom until he's dry. Those dogs also don't take their owner's word for it when something is safe. And not necessarily because of a lack of training. Some of these dogs are really well trained. I've seen dogs that do dog sports that have this issue. But when they spend time working on actually touching your dog, touching those feet, getting the dog used to, listen, you can trust me with anything. And I'm going to say it's not just trust, there's a bond that happens with that. So that now when something else is happening and you're like, listen, I've got this under control. You're fine. I'm here with you. And I'm not going to let that dog come over near us, or whatever the case may be. Like I said, these are two dogs in the same family with kind of opposite issues, right? But I want you to think that trust right there up against their body is super important. Because they aren't going to trust you that Girl Scout isn't coming over with that cookie box to kill dogs. Right? We know the Girl Scout's coming over with cookies and we're happy about it, but the dog doesn't get that, right? If we're going to teach them to trust us for some of these bigger things, it's really helpful if they trust us with these small things, which aren't all that small when you think about touching and touching all over. There's an intimacy about that, right? That, whoa, like, I can let you touch me all over and maybe somebody else in the family, and then extend it out to the vet and to a groomer. And, that there's not something that any Tom, Dick, and Harry is going to do, right? These are things that we do specifically with this particular dog and to help them feel safe with us, right? So these two dogs, we're doing really, really good work with their owners. Their owners are brushing their teeth. Their owners are, looking at their paws, wiping them down, spending time touching them all over. So what we worked on was looking at something, but instead of doing it as a touching exercise, like examine, like, oh, okay, now I want you to imagine that there's a thorn in that paw. Or the dog's limping and you really need to look over that paw. So really examine the paw. And actually later in the lesson, the German Shepherd was laying on the mat, and he's trying to itch his leg and his front leg with his mouth, and his back leg is doing the scratching thing. And I went over to him. I'm like, oh, buddy, is there something you can't reach? Now, those of us who are more dog savvy could see that that's probably him trying to reach an itch. Like, he can't quite get it. And the back leg's going. And so I go over this time because he actually has an itch. He's a little bit more sensitive about it. But I was able to show the owners. Now look at what his brow is doing. Do you see around his eyes that he's a little unsure? Do you see how I'm helping him relax for it and just touching gently until he really kind of takes a breath? And we get him loose again. And then take a look. And he actually had like a little scab there. So who knows, maybe he was running around, hit a stick, who knows, but there's a little scab there. But to have the trust there for us to be like, okay, let's calm down. Let's take a look. And it's different than we need you to be comfortable with us touching you all over, right? Which I think that we tend to do. And I find that's usually a starting point, right? Like, oh, let's touch you all over and make it fun time. But we also need to pull it back into, okay, now let's make it quiet and I need to examine you time because examine you is different. Like, let me take a look. And he was a little bit apprehensive about it. And I was able to loosen him up. And the bigger part was that his owners were able to see, oh, yeah, I do see the moment that he really loosened up. And then you got like down, then I got there down with like my face and I'm looking at his armpit because I got him to be loose for it. Like, hey, buddy, I know you've only known me for a week, but I'm your pal. Let's take a look, because now there was actually something there to look at. So these are just some examples from my week with normal day-to-day dogs. Right? I know it's really hard sometimes to listen to a podcast and think about how you're going to apply it to a particular dog. So I'm kind of hoping that these examples are giving you more chances to say, oh, that sounds like so-and-so. Or maybe I can try that with that schnauzer that I know. But to think a little bit more about each dog and collecting them, helping them relax, calm, comfortable, cooperative, helping them get a chance to wiggle instead of becoming frustrated, right? Like, we don't want them to become frustrated and then get a break. We want to keep them at the point where they're comfortable, right? Help them find that comfort zone and then build on it and build on it and keep expanding that comfort zone so that they can feel comfortable for the long haul. And that they can accept things that maybe they didn't accept 10 minutes before. For example, the puppy, who if I had gone and tried to use scissors up in front of her face at the beginning, would have thought that was horrifying. But by the end, she was like, oh yeah, combs and scissors, okay. So we want to be gradual and keep in mind that dogs are silly, silly little beings. And that's part of what we love about them. So we need to help them be able to be calm and switch it up to silly if we need to, and then calm down again. But even with the older dogs that I was talking about, we weren't doing an awful lot with cookies with that. And I do train with cookies, and this was a training appointment for us. But for the touching, I was like, you know what? We're just touching, and then it can go back to petting, and then it can go back to touching and go back to petting. But I didn't want to add cookies if we don't need to, because cookies will have to be phased out later. And trainers, I want you to really think about that because we've talked before about the grooming setting, a grooming shop with multiple dogs, and dogs walking around, and dogs in crates, and dogs in tubs, and dogs on tables, is not necessarily a good setting for using lots of cookies. So in many ways, I'm trying to come up with ways for us to avoid cookie use so that we don't have to fade it out later, and so that it becomes so commonplace for touching to be the reward also. Why not? Why not make touching the reward? Like, oh, now they're going to pet my ears. Okay. Like I've said before, my dogs love brushing. My cats loved brushing. The dogs that I groom enjoy a good brushing because brushing feels good. So many of the things that we're doing with them already feel good. Like, I wouldn't complain if someone was going to massage warm soap into my skin. That doesn't seem like a terrifying thing, and it doesn't seem unpleasant, right? So a lot of the things that we already do in a grooming process are pleasant. So we can use that, and we can just help dogs understand that gradually, I'm touching you in these ways, and that there are lots of different ways that we touch dogs. So hopefully some of my examples have been helpful for you. The weekly action step this week is to think about ways to help other pros also understand that early grooming appointments don't need to be a full groom, and that it's much more about learning, and the earlier, the better. So if you're a vet, try to make sure that trainers and groomers know that. If you're a groomer, make sure your vet and your trainers know that. Trainers the same, make sure your vet and your groomers know that. But try to come up with a network of other professionals who are on the same page, and that's your breeders also, and your doggy daycares, but to have a all of us saying the same things, that your earliest grooming appointments don't need to be full grooms, and they're much more about learning that this is pleasant and safe. If you'd like to talk to me, you can find me through my grooming and training business, happycrittersdogtraining.com, my email, chrissy@happycritters.net, and through the Creating Great Grooming Dogs Facebook page. And we have these awesome devices in our pockets that allow us to do live video with each other. I can help you with the dog on your table. We can set up live lessons, and you may be surprised at how much we can get accomplished together via video.